In our last presentation, we spoke about Stephen and Ricky and how they were misreading the gospel story of Jesus walking on the sea as if it had been written by, for, and about Americans and other Western people. Even the most current studies attempting to understand the Jesus of history generally take little cognizance of the fact that he became incarnate in the ancient Mediterranean world. Anthropologists who specialize in this region and its literary records point out that approximately 90% of world cultures and 80% of circum-Mediterranean cultures readily experience altered states of consciousness. From the biblical record alone, which is included in the Anthropological Databank, it is evident that the people of this ancient culture were certainly among that 80%. Studies of Moroccan Jews in Israel are particularly enlightening in this regard. When they were forcibly repatriated to Israel in the 1950s and 1960s, the Moroccan Jews carried with them not only their personal belongings, but their beliefs, values, and traditions. They revitalized their practices and attached them to new sites and new saints to substitute for those they left behind. One of these takes place at the tomb of Rabbi Shimeon Bar Yochai at Meren Near-Zafed. On the anniversary of his death, these devotees make a pilgrimage to his tomb, celebrate a picnic-like feast in the surrounding countryside, and expect to see him in a dream. And they do. The dream pattern typically has 4 elements, common in altered state of consciousness experiences, or ASC experiences for short. 1. Those experiencing the vision are initially frightened. And 2. Do not recognize the figure appearing before them. 3. The figure appearing before them offers calming assurance. Do not be afraid. And 4. Identifies herself or himself. It is I. Then the figure offers information. Maybe it's clarification of identity or the granting of a favor, for example, healing or a healing strategy. The purpose of the experience is to illuminate a puzzle in life or to suggest or approve a line of conduct. Notice that this is not a literary form. It is a pattern of human experience constructed by the culture rather than by someone's creative imagination. Jesus and those who knew him were quite familiar with and adept at experiences of alternate reality. Accounts of Jesus' baptism, transfiguration, walking on the Sea of Galilee, and post-death or post-resurrection appearances readily fit into the common Mediterranean cultural experiences of altered states of consciousness, even when the experience that is reported is so in an incomplete or selective manner. Aside from dreams and angelic appearances featured prominently in the infancy narratives of Matthew and Luke, the synoptics report 5 main incidents of such visions and/or appearances in the career of Jesus. The dunking of Jesus, also called his baptism, an experience in altered reality. The testing of Jesus, also called the temptation of Jesus, an experience in altered states of consciousness. Of course, walking on the sea stories, which we have been dealing with at some length in these presentations, another ASC experience. The transfiguration accounts of Jesus, another example of Jesus in altered reality. And of course, the resurrection appearances, also ASC experiences, that we will deal with soon. When Jesus comes walking on the Sea of Galilee toward his disciples, 1. They are frightened. 2. They do not recognize Jesus, thinking instead that they are seeing a ghost. 3. Jesus calms them. Be not afraid. 4. Jesus identifies himself. It is I. So far so good for this being an example of an ASC experience. The document we call Matthew illustrates what happens when a person breaks the trance. The Matthean Peter is not convinced that he is really seeing the Matthean Jesus and demands, "If it is you, bid me to come to you on the water." Jesus says, "Come," and Peter progresses toward Jesus. But then the wind, the personified wind, startled him. His fear returns, his skepticism returns, and he began to sink, as will happen if one steps out of alternate reality back into consensual reality, out of the trance into a waking state. The trance experience will not continue in the waking state, just as a dream interrupted does not ordinarily resume after the interruption, despite diligent attempts to fall back asleep again into the dream. True to the style of high-context literature, the Gospels we call Mark and John do not report the meaning of this ASC experience. They presume that their intended audience knows it. While in the document called Mark, the disciples are utterly astounded and still puzzling over the multiplied loaves of bread, in the fourth gospel we call John, they are glad to take him into the boat. The gospel called Matthew spells out the purpose, perhaps as the author we call Matthew sees it, understands it, interprets it. Jesus is the Son of God. This trance experience provides the disciples with yet another insight into the identity of Jesus, a new piece of information or further confirmation of an insight already known, but gradually deepening. Anthropological psychologists who specialize in ASC experiences emphasize that the content of these experiences is vacuous, hence Peter's doubt. You'll recall that visions do not come with soundtracks. Your culturally informed brain provides the soundtrack, meaning it provides the interpretation of what you're experiencing. It is the culture of the recipient to the vision that provides the information necessary to interpret the experience. Since all things come from God, we can say this is inspired from God. The cultural baggage also. And this is where the cultural baggage, the cultural information from both the Old Testament and from the pre-gospel reports from polytheistic traditions is relevant. This is where the parallels with Moses' power over the sea is relevant, as is Poseidon's rule over the sea is relevant. Narrow concentration on literal correspondences to construct the literary form, though, misses the forest for the trees. Both sources, whether it's Old Testament reports, like of Moses controlling the waves, parting the sea, or the pre-gospel polytheistic reports of Poseidon control of the sea, indicate that the activity of walking on the sea or making a pathway in the sea demonstrates that such a person is superior to and in control of the personified sea, whether he is riding a chariot on the waves or literally walking on its surface. The First Testament is particularly helpful here because it echoes a motif that occurs frequently in the Gospels. From the very beginning of Genesis, the second verse, the God of Israel is over the waters. God's breath or spirit or powerful wind is over and in control of the waves of the abyss. In the New Testament, Jesus seems to be doing something that only the God of Israel can do. In this case, walking on the sea. Now, do we conclude from that that means these stories are saying Jesus is God? Hold on. It would be premature to conclude that from these stories alone, the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and John are claiming divinity for Jesus. We have to remember that doctrine develops, and it takes a long time to unpack all of these things and arrive at our Niceno-Constantinopolitan profession of faith. Centuries. We should not proof text our doctrines from these stories. It would be premature to conclude that Jesus is God from these stories alone. That isn't what the original audiences, the intended audiences of Mark, Matthew, and John would take from them. Rather, the intended audiences would recognize that Jesus is an extraordinary human being, one with a seemingly distinctive relationship to God, the one who normally behaves this way over the waters. Somehow, Jesus is able to do what only God can do. He must be authorized by God to do this. In the Hebrew tradition, this cumulative evidence would continue to build Jesus' reputation as a holy man, a chazid or zadik, that is, an Israelite shamanic figure who has a special relationship to the God of Israel and can barter special benefits or favors with alternate reality for fellow humans. He can navigate the worlds. Some concordances list the appearance of the risen Jesus in Luke chapter 24, verse 37, as a parallel to the story of Jesus walking on the sea. Actually, the elements of fear, lack of recognition, allaying of fear, and communication of new information or assurance of a course of action to be taken, common to ASC experiences, are quite normal in the resurrection appearances found in the Gospels, which are also experiences of a person's alternate reality, namely Jesus' alternate reality. Recall that these accounts of Jesus walking on the sea are culturally patterned experience, not a literary invention or creation or device. It is inappropriate, therefore, to consider the ASC experience of Jesus walking on the sea as a retrojected resurrection experience. It has often been repeated that the historical critical method is dead. It's been dead for over 50 years. It simply has not delivered what it promised. And what did it promise? To give us a clearer, more realistic picture of the historical Jesus. Perhaps the real problem is that the historical critical method has been neither sufficiently historical nor sufficiently critical. Cultural insights about the pan-human experience of alternate states of consciousness would enhance both literary critical and historical critical studies. In this light, the historical Jesus stands out ever so clearly as a typical person of his first century Mediterranean culture.